Wartime diplomacy. We'll first look at trying to solve this student objective, the factors that led to Allied victory in World War II. And let's first look at why the Allies were successful in defeating Germany. And one big reason is the amount of support and cooperation among the Allies. World War II, more so than any other war, was a war about production. And the side that could outproduce the other was probably going to win. But what's really important is that the Allies worked together to achieve those goals. And it started way back before the United States even entered the war. As you know, in the 1930s, the United States wrote some neutrality acts designed to keep them out of the war. But by the summer of 1940, those are starting to go away. And it goes away first with a deal between the United States and Britain to send 50 old U.S. destroyers, like you see in the background there. These are Navy ships that aren't quite as big as battleships, but still pretty tough. 50 old U.S. destroyers were sent to England in exchange for America getting leases on British naval and air bases in the Caribbean. It wasn't necessarily that we needed these strategic locations, but it made it look like we weren't just giving them weapons to fight the Nazis. This is followed by the Lend-Lease Act, which is signed into law in March of 1941. This allowed the President of the United States to give or sell weapons to countries that the President deemed essential to our defense. So if it was important for one nation to be able to defend themselves so that the United States could stay safe, then the President could give them weapons. As you can see, this is used to send a lot of weapons to Great Britain, but also a lot to the Soviet Union and overseas to China, as well as Australia and New Zealand. In fact, almost as many tons of material were supplied to Russia as the United States eventually brought over during the war for our very own troops. The United States gets further involved in World War II with the signing of the Atlantic Charter. And this was signed in August of 1941 by the United States and Great Britain, and soon afterwards by the Soviet Union and other nations at war with the Axis powers. And what it said was the following. They agreed on self-determination for all peoples. They agreed on lowering trade barriers. And they agreed on replacing the League of Nations with something that would prevent global war in the future. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s are basically nullified, basically repealed once the United States Navy starts escorting U.S. merchant ships all the way to Iceland. And this happened in 1941 as well. So U.S. naval ships are sailing almost all the way across the Atlantic to help make sure goods get to Great Britain and to Russia as well. So the Neutrality Acts are basically non-existent by this point. That cooperation between the Allies takes another big step in 1942 when FDR and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, met in Washington for a conference where they agreed, now that the United States was in the war, we entered the war December 7th, 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to some important things. First, they were going to take care of Germany first and then worry about Japan and the Pacific. Second, they will name a supreme commander in each area of the war. So there'll be a supreme commander for Europe. And what that means is that one commander will give orders to forces from all the nations involved. So if an American commander like Dwight Eisenhower is the supreme commander, that means that he is in charge of the American forces, but the British forces in that theater of war as well. Also at this conference, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to share ships and share materials as best they could during the war. This is going to help them use their collective production power to win the war. In 1943, there's another meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, this time in Casablanca in Morocco in northern Africa. And here, the two allies agreed to do the following. They would increase their support for the Soviet Union. They would also increase their support for China, who was fighting against the Japanese. They also agreed to accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. What that means is there's not going to be a peace treaty where Germany gets to keep something or where Japan gets to dictate the terms of the treaty. These are going to be peace treaties that are completely determined by the Allied powers. And this is really put in to make the Soviets less nervous. The Soviets were worried that Great Britain or the United States might settle with Germany, might settle with a peace treaty with Germany, while the Soviet Union still fought on with Germany. In other words, they are saying there will be no separate peace treaties either. And that's something that had actually been stated earlier, but it really is formally declared at the Casablanca Conference of 1943. That same year, Stalin joins Churchill and FDR in Tehran, in Iran. Tehran is the capital of Iran. And at that conference, they agreed that the British and the Americans would invade France at the same time that Russia mounted a major offensive effort on the Eastern Front. So they would be hitting Germany on both sides of Europe. At that conference, the Soviet Union also agreed to enter the war against Japan once Germany had been defeated, and all three of the Allied powers agreed to create an international organization to maintain peace after the war. What they're talking about and what they're starting to make plans for is making the United Nations. Another reason why the Allies had success over Germany could be summarized as air superiority. The German Air Force was a formidable foe early in the war. However, Hitler and the Nazis had tried to attack Great Britain and had tried to force Great Britain into surrender with what's called the Battle of Britain, which was an extensive bombing campaign by the German Air Force on Great Britain. And because of the success of the Royal Air Force, the British airplanes, and because of a new piece of technology known as radar, the British were very successful and shot down many of the German planes. And by the end of the war, the German Air Force is no longer that formidable. In fact, it's virtually non-existent. So when the Allies invade France on D-Day, in the summer of 1944, they enjoy air superiority. There is no one challenging them in the air. And that will continue as the Allies push into Germany. Another reason for the success over Germany is the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge was a last-ditch offensive effort by Hitler and the Nazis to try to push the Allied forces out of France and back into the sea. It is moderately successful at first for Germany, but it does not achieve the goal of driving the Allies out of France. And as a result, Germany uses up all of their reserves in the Battle of the Bulge. This means that the Allied forces can move easily from France into Germany, and it also makes it easier for the Soviets to move into Germany from Eastern Europe. Think of the Battle of the Bulge like a Hail Mary at the end of the game that gets intercepted. And as a result, American and British forces pour into Germany from the west, and Russian forces pour into Germany from the east.